I know don't have any announcement, but I know Brother Scott's not here with us today, and he, Myra, and Abby are, I think, on vacation. I'm assuming that's where they're at. I don't know about Mason, if he's with them or not. But it is good to be here. I know we have several that will be traveling this week or are traveling right now. I'm assuming that there are some of the that will be traveling. But this morning, just in a moment, we'll be getting started. You have a page number, Ralph? 22. 22 will be our page number in our book. We'll be having a song, opening prayer just in a moment. Nathan will be having our opening prayer. And we're going to get into Leviticus 16. That's something that we had passed out the other day. And I think there's some extra copies in the foyer if we need one of those. And I was actually supposed to give you 17. I've got it ready over 16 and 17 go kind of back to back. And I was going to put those together, and I just failed to hand that one out to you. And I will try to get that out to you today also. So with that being said, we'll have our song, our prayer, and we'll get into our lesson. Any announcements? Anybody? I didn't ask it. Anybody have any announcements?
Remember, my daughter, she's going to have shoulder surgery the 26th of this month.
Okay.
And Carla's doing well after her.
So Carla's had her surgery, doing well.
Yeah, she's doing well.
Okay. All right. If we don't care, make sure we get a name for me just in a minute, and I'll write it down out here.
Okay.
Number 22. All hail the power of Jesus' name, let angels prostrate fall. Bring forth the royal diadem and crown him Lord of all. Bring forth the royal diadem and crown him Lord of all. Oh, that with yonder sacred throne we at his feet may fall. We'll join the everlasting song and crown him Lord of all. We'll join the everlasting song and crown him Lord of all.
Let us pray. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for this beautiful day that you have given us, being with the sick and the shut-ins, that they might get well soon, and be with the teachers, Brother Kenny and Brother and he might remember everything he has studied to teach everybody. Our prayer in Christ's name we pray. Amen.
So this morning, as we get started back, we've had a couple of weeks that we've been kind of away from Leviticus, and want to get back into it, do the best that we can. And we had, if you remember and recall, we were on chapters 13, 14, 15, and I was finishing up with those. And matter of fact, I think I had lagged just a little, and I want to review that just a little bit before I go into 16. And when we looked at those chapters, and I went over these things, remember, when we studied all this, God is really, not I want to say controlling, but putting stipulations on every part of their life, from the worship, the cleanliness, the food they eat, It's everything. He wants them to be holy and set apart. That's something, it's a common theme. It's in this book in Leviticus, and even, remember, in Exodus as he brings them out. He wants them to be set apart. So he's telling them the kosher side of things, the kosher to be different, separate, and to be holy. And of course, we know a lot of this that we talked about. There's reasoning, obvious reasoning for it, for their health, the cleanliness, and things like this. And some things I don't know why he said that, but it was just the way it was. So with all that being said, we were actually talking about leprosy, the last few chapters, about how to deal with leprosy, how to take someone that has been considered unclean. And if you remember, leprosy also was covering all the skin ailments. And we think of leprosy being that one caused by the bacterium leprae. And of course, it covered more than that, because my understanding, once you got leprosy, there's really no turning back. The only way that you, just being honest about, the only way you were cured is if you were healed by Jesus Christ or God himself. And those things, at this point, Jesus wasn't there, so it just didn't happen. It was pretty much an inch by inch death. And so there were some skin diseases that could be cured, so they were very cautious about letting people back into the community that had these diseases. Because if they let them in, obviously, just like we dealt with, you could spread and it would take over a congregation or take over a family or a community quickly. So 13, 14, and 15, we talked about the cleanliness, how to become clean, and to make yourself holy. And you had to do certain things to do that. So that was 13, 14, and 15. And did anybody have any questions about that? You know, I brought up the fact that in the story, and if you look in chapter 15 about the woman with the many blood issues, and we talked about that when we read, I think it was in Luke chapter 8:40, and where the woman who had issues for 12 years came up, and just the faith that she had just to be able to touch the hem of his garment. And he, of course, questions, who touched me? And I was asking Ralph about, was there a song in the book that if there was a song in there that meant something similar to that. And of course, I didn't find one, because I know there are songs out there in the gospel industry that sings that, but God knew, Jesus Christ knew that somebody touched him. He said, I can, paraphrasing, feel the energy leaving me as this woman was healed. So when we talk about healing, Christ had that ability, and the apostles who walked with him saw these things. And as I kind of get off topic a little bit, so as I read those things about how that even the apostles was with him and saw these, I don't think they still truly believed who he was. I've read different things about that. Some did, some were still not sure until the very end. Okay, until they actually seen him again. Remember, Thomas was one of them that that's why we call him Doubting Thomas, I guess. Okay, so finishing up on 15, and we're starting into 16, and I'm hoping when we get to the end, I will pass out 17. I have it laying here. I was going to give both of them out at the same time, and for some reason I hadn't had it run off. I don't know what happened. I had the rest of them run off, but I didn't have 17, but I'll get that out to you. So with all that being said, we're going to start in 16, and it talks about the very top. If you have a sheet, if you don't have a sheet, there are some in the foyer out there, and it's the Great Day of Atonement. We have talked about this. When we get, and we'll get back to this and review just in a moment. But the term Yom Kippur is used for Great Day of Atonement. It is atonement. That's what the Jews give it the name as being. And this started and it continued on. And God is actually going to tell the Israelites, when you get into the land that I promised you, this is, He's done, and God's done telling them, this is what you do when you get there. It's not like if, it's when you get there. And so that was a confidence that He instilled in the Israelite nation. So some things will be mentioned about in the houses. Even if you remember we talked about, He gave them the laws on leprosy, about scraping the houses, the mortar, the brick. He is done telling them this before they're entered into the promised land. And so this is some things that as we review over. So with that being said, I'm going to make a few statements and I'm going to get into the reading, but I'm going to paraphrase a few things before we do that. So Yom Kippur started and it ended at a certain time. Not necessarily what some Jews do, but they quit celebrating this because of, and I read about this, and about 70 AD, somewhere in there, when the Romans destroyed the temple, they had nowhere to sacrifice or bring their animals to sacrifice. And that's where you get a little split in some of the belief systems there. And about that time, I'm not going to get off down that rabbit hole, but Paul, as we know at that time, wasn't Paul, it was someone else, and by the name of Saul was given the name there, and so that's another story for another day. Okay, so let me read us something in the review. I don't know how much you have on your sheets. I make myself notes all over mine, and I go over them, so I kind of give a basic reading on yours. So the review, the Day of Atonement was once a year. It was the 10th day of the 7th month. This is what it was called. This is when it was to be celebrated. So if you do your history a little bit, you'll access the 10th day, but the new year, what they consider to be the new year, was 10 days prior. It was on that first day. And then they have 10 days in between. It was more or less the days of mourning for them in between those days, but then you have the Day of Atonement for the Jews. This was more like a Sabbath day. It was to be treated as a Sabbath day. And you're going to hear them, even in this time, talk about afflicting their souls. And the things I've read, which means the fasting and the thought process upon their sins. So that's what it was to be done as. And we're going to talk about some atonement, the burnt offerings, the sin offerings, the difference between that. We've already studied those. If you remember back a little bit, we talked about, back earlier in Leviticus, the first few chapters, we talked about there's a burnt offering. There is the meal offering, that was the grain offering. There was a peace offering, there was a sin offering, and a trespass offering. So when we study, in this chapter, we're going to talk primarily about the two things that's being done here. Burnt offering and sin offering. And we're going to look at the difference. As a matter of fact, I went back and added a few things in there. I don't know if your sheet's got it on there, but let's look at the difference or the correlation between the two just a little bit. So, the burnt offering, it was atoning blood of the animals, and it was at that time not mandatory that they do. They were to do this, but it was to burn the entire animal up. Nothing was saved, no meat, anything like that, except I think the skin was taken to the priest. But this was offering an atonement for their sins. Bear with me. I hope my voice holds up. It says, after laying the hands upon the animal, the sinner, in this case, this is the priest going to be doing this, was to kill the animal, and the animal's dead. And we're going to see the first thing that's got to happen when we look at this just in a moment, the different things that's going to have to take place, is first of all, Aaron has got to do this for himself and his family. Then we're going to see it has to be done for the tabernacle. Because everything, that God can't bring in the presence of sin. And then the people will be the next thing. Okay. The priests were to present the blood to God upon the altar of the burnt offering. The whole animal was be dissected and burnt upon the altar for a sweet savor. We've heard that before being mentioned. And then the sin offering, this is chapter 4, it comes out of that, was a more or less, it was intentional sin a lot of times that was committed or sin, and they had to be recognized, and the blood was to cover, because it didn't take away sin. Remember that. Only today our sins are taken away by one means, and that's by Christ himself, who came and died upon the cross. But all these sins we're talking about were just covered. They were not taken away. So burnt offering was similar ritual performed as a holy ritual offered to the priest voluntarily in recognition of sin and need of atonement. Also, it was dedicated to God. Now, the burnt offerings were voluntary. The burnt offerings were never, the meat was never eaten, but were totally consumed by the fire. Now, the sin offering, the person was unintentional sin against any of the commandments, and the priest that does this work, in this case, is going to be Aaron, and the high priest, as a matter of fact, he's going to be in there all day long. It's going to be him. And there's a correlation that was given as I was reading this, how the high priest, when he does all this work, of course, he doesn't get to sit down. He's busy all day long. Now, you think about this, and as I was reading it, to kill an animal, dissect it, and put it on the fire. In other words, to butcher an animal. I don't know how many of you have hunted and butchered and cut up an animal such as a deer. It's not something you do in 10 or 15 minutes. This is a long process. You have to skin it, and of course the bowels, everything has to come out, then butcher the animal, put it on the fire. And so these are things that took him a long time, and there's several animals that we're going to look at that was taking place. So the sin offering were, and we're going to look at this, some of it was, in the sin offering burnt outside the camp for different reasons, but in this case, the high priest is in charge. This is what's going to happen. There's going to be people that has to carry it outside the camp. There's going to be a process for them. We're going to get to the goats just in a minute, process for them. So it's a long process as they go through this. Okay, I'm going to look at, as I set this up, the 5 animals that is going to be looked at here. Ralph and I actually were discussing this because I was looking for something. I couldn't put my finger on it. I think it was Wednesday night. Was it Wednesday night we were talking about that, Ralph? So let's look at, there's going to be a bull. This for a sin offering. That's for Aaron and his family. There's going to be a ram for a burnt offering, and that's for Aaron and his family. That's the 2 things. That's the first 2. We'll look at those in the verse in just a moment. Then it's going to talk about the 2 kid goats. These are for the people. There's going to be one for a sin offering. There's going to be one for what's called the scapegoat. And we'll talk about that. We've already mentioned that just a little bit. And then the 5th one is a ram, and this is the burnt offering of the people. So when we read through this, it'll talk about the animal itself. Now, as we look at this chapter, let's look at the verses 1 through 7. It's going to be talking about the preparation for the priest, as they do everything they can for themselves, and this is Aaron, but he's also doing this for his family. And then you're going to have the preparation for the tabernacle, and that's going to be verses 8 through 19. And then the preparation of the people, and that's going to be 20 through 34. As we look at this, kind of set the chapter up. All right, so let's read into the chapter. Leviticus 16, verse 1, And the Lord spake unto Moses after the death of his 2 sons, Aaron, when they offered before the God and died. Now, so here's what's happening if we were to look at this. So this is not soon after the 2 sons died, and Moses is going to tell Aaron, by God's voice, this is what I need you to do. Be very careful at when and how you enter into the holy place. Well, why? Well, let's look back just a little bit. If you think back on some verses earlier in the other chapters, when Moses was speaking to, I think it was Exodus 33:7, and the verse 7, is where Moses took his tent and pitched it outside the camp, and he would go and speak to God about different things. And when the people saw that, they would get out of their tent, they would stand and they would worship, because they knew that's what he was doing. He was speaking to God, and it says, as a man would face to face. Now, I'm going to add this to it. Moses couldn't see God. He told him, you can't look upon me because you will surely die. And back earlier, Moses said, well, let me see your glory. And he told him, you'll see the backside when I pass through. And so what we're looking at this is at how Moses couldn't look upon God. He could see the effects, maybe the backside, but he couldn't look upon God because he would surely die. Now, setting that up in this setting where Aaron is telling Moses to tell Aaron, when you go into the most holy place, you won't be able to, you just can't come in at any time because you will surely die. And the reason for that is God is in that holy place, the most holy. And if you enter in while I'm in there, you cannot look upon me, you will surely die. So that's the reasoning behind this. Just can't go in any time. And we'll also look when he goes into the most holy place, and we'll read that just in a moment. He'll have to take this incense and put it in the fire, the coals inside this, and it'll build up a smoke inside this most holy place. And in my mind, I think that's to keep him from having to look upon God's face. I don't know. I wasn't there, and we weren't there, so we don't know what it looks like. Now, if you'll recall this just for a moment, if you come in to the sanctuary, you come in obviously to the meeting place. The gates was on the east side, and you enter in. The first thing you come to is where they burn the animals, and then you go on a little bit farther on, and there's a laver of water there. We're going to hear about that just in a minute. About the priests had to wash themselves up. And then you enter into the holy place. And as you look into the holy place, you'll see to the right side the bread of showbread that's sitting there with how many loaves? 12. 12 loaves for a reason. And then you look to the left, there is what's called the Gomorrah. And I think, if I'm saying that right, it's those 7 lamps. The 7 candlesticks is what it's called. And then you go a little farther, right before you enter into the most holy place, and it was a 15 by 15 room, the most holy place in the back. And as you go in there, there's another, it was the incense, the fire of incense was right there, is what it's called a lot of times. So as we study all this, remember there's a few things we have to recall back, that the fire, the burnt offering, the fire could never go out. Always had to be something going. It was something the priests were to keep that going. So when we hear about he took the coals from the fire, he put it on the incense, that's where it's coming from. Okay, kind of set all this up. And let me go into verse 3. And thus shall Aaron come into the holy place with a young bullock for a sin offering and a ram for the burnt offering. That's 2 animals we talked about. And he shall put the holy linen coat, that they shall have the linen breeches in his flesh, and he shall gird up his loins. Now, if you think back, we talked about this whole outfit that he had to put on. First of all, of course, he had to wash himself, and we'll see that before and after. He washed himself, put this on, gets ready for this great day of atonement. Because once he goes in and offers his sacrifice, he's got to have this on. And then when he gets through, he's going to take all this off, take a bath, and come back and put his other clothes on. So it was a getting prepared. As we get prepared, prepare ourselves to come to church. As we come to church, we worship God, we get ourselves ready mentally and physically. Verse 4. Let me go on to verse 5. I read that. And he shall take the congregation of the children of Israel 2 kids of the goat for a sin offering, one ram for a burnt offering. So that's the animals I've just described to you. Verse 6. And Aaron shall offer his bullock for the sin offering and for himself, and make an atonement for himself and his house. And he shall take the 2 goats and present them before the Lord, the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. I'm on verse 8. And Aaron shall cast lots into the 2 goats. In other words, he's going to choose. One of them has got to be chosen for the sin offering, and one's going to be for the scapegoat. And Aaron shall bring the goat which the Lord's lot fell, and offer him for the sin offering. But the goat which lot fell for the scapegoat shall be presented live before the Lord to make an atonement for him, and let him go as a scapegoat into the wilderness. And they call this place Azazel. This is the goat that they'll be basically, he'll be putting his hands on and talking about the sins for this goat, so it can be escaped. Now, as I understand and read this, they'll take this goat out, and somebody will have to take it out and lead it to Azazel. And some of the ancient history that I found out that it's not something you can just see, it's going to be out of sight. And so they will relay the messages once it's gone back to the people that the scapegoat is gone. In other words, the sins were put upon the goat to be taken away. Any question or comment up to this point? Now, this very sophisticated, very sophisticated thing that had to be done for the people and for the house of Israel, for the tabernacle, and it was something taken very seriously. Okay, let me go on down to verse 12. And he shall take a censer full of the burning coals of fire from the altar before the Lord, and his hands full of sweet incense, beaten small, and bring into the veil. So he's got all this incense, he's got the coals, he's going to put the incense in the coals, take it inside the veil, inside the most holy, and it's going to create a cloud and aroma inside this. Now, if you remember, if we go inside the most holy place, well, let me just go on. I don't want to get ahead of myself. Verse 14, and he shall take the blood of the bullock and sprinkle it with his finger upon the mercy seat eastward, and before the mercy seat he shall sprinkle the blood with his finger 7 times. A specific ritual was performed here, not only with the bull, but also the goats. Same thing had to happen. Eastward, sprinkling the blood 7 times. Then he shall kill the goat with a sin offering, that is for the people, and bring this blood within the veil, and go with the blood that he did with the blood of the bullock. Now, so you got the Ark of the Covenant sitting there, and you got the solid gold mercy seat sitting on it, and of course there's things inside. We know that, we've already talked about that. And you got the 2 cherubims facing each other, and as I understand, God is living in this area. And so he is to sprinkle the blood toward the mercy seat. That's the east side. And remember, you enter the east side 7 times. Okay, so at the bottom there, it just gives us a little bit of review that I'd put on there. Things I've just talked about. Look on top of page 60. In this case, is note the, I'm on the very top, note the orderly fashion Aaron was to work as a high priest. First was to take the sin offering and sacrifice for his own self and the household. That was very important. He couldn't do any work unless he did and cleansed himself first. Secondly, Aaron is to take the 2 goats for the sin offering. 1 goat would be used for a sacrifice, the other released into the wilderness. And I'll give you the name there where it would be released to. Thirdly, Aaron is to take the censer full of coals from the fire of the burnt offerings and 2 handfuls of incense, the sweet aroma, to put into the fire. And then Aaron is to take the blood of the burnt offering and sprinkle it on the with his left finger on the east side of the mercy 7 times. I don't know why it was done the particular way. It was given instructions to do that. That's the way it was. Look at verse 16. And he shall make an atonement for the holy place. Remember, this is now the holy place, because the uncleanness of the children of Israel, because of the transgressions and all their sins, and shall he do for the tabernacle of the congregation that remaineth among them in the midst of the uncleanliness. So now you got to cleanse the tabernacle. He himself, his family were cleansed. The tabernacle now is cleansed. Look on down now, the very bottom, chapter 17. And there shall be no man in the tabernacle of congregation when he goeth to make an atonement for the place, until he come out and have made an atonement for himself and for his household and the congregation of Israel. Verse 18. And he shall go out into the altar that is before the Lord, and make an atonement for it, and it shall make the blood of the bullock, the blood of the goat, and put it upon the horns around about the altar, around an altar round about. Which, remember, there's a difference in the sin offering and the burnt offering, what was to be done. The burnt offering is totally consumed, and then you got the sin offerings to be done a little bit differently. And I'm not going to read through all the summaries there. Look at chapter 16, verse 20 through 22. And when he hath made an end of the reconciling the holy place, the tabernacle of the congregation and the altar, he shall bring the live goat. And Aaron shall lay his hands upon the head of the goat, confess over the iniquities of the children of Israel and their transgression. Now, think about this. He's to give all the sins of the people for that whole year. Now, I don't know how many categories that was. I read different ones. It could have been as many 40 to 40-something categories he had to cover. But you can imagine, as he more or less confessing their sins to God, it would take a while. I don't know how long it took, but it would take a while as he laid his hands upon this goat to do that. Verse 22, and the goat shall bear upon him all their iniquities into a land not inhabited. In other words, that's Azazel. All right, look on down to 23 through 28. And Aaron shall come into the tabernacle of congregation, and shall take off the linen garments and put on when he went into the holy place, and shall leave them there. In other words, they stay inside that area. Verse 24, and he shall wash his flesh with water in the holy place, and put on his garments, and come forth and offer his burnt offering. That's what we were talking about, Ralph and I, a minute ago. And the burnt offering of the people, and make an atonement for himself and for the people. So you can imagine this long laid out procedure that was being done throughout this. And we got to go over and do this step, and we got to go over and do this step, and then come back in at some point and do another step. Verse 25, and the fat of the sin offering shall be burnt upon the altar. And he that let go the goat, the scapegoat, shall wash his clothes and bathe his in fresh water. Now, whoever takes the goat and leads it out has got to do the same thing before he enter back into the congregation of people, wash himself in fresh water, his clothes, himself, and he can come back into the camp. Verse 27, and the bullock for the sin offering, and the goat for the sin offering, whose blood was brought into the atonement, into the holy place, shall be carried forth without the camp. Remember, that was one thing I mentioned just a minute ago. It had to be carried outside the camp, and they would be burnt, even their skins, at that point in time. Every part of it, even the insides, will be burnt. Verse 28, and he burneth them, wash their clothes, and bathe in fresh water afterwards. So whoever does that does the same procedure. We know what Aaron did. He had to clean himself up when he's through. The person who took the scapegoat, as he left with it, before he could enter back in, had to clean himself up, to be clean again. Same person that took the scraps, so to speak, out to be burned, had to do the same procedure. So it was a very orchestrated procedure that had to be done. Okay. I've got the summaries there from 23, 28, but a couple of things I want to point out. It says it shows here the term being used is to be cleansed, to be freed from the punishment of sin. That's what they're talking about. Remember, the sin, the blood that we're talking about, these bulls and goats, can't take away sin. It can cover it, in this case, but it can't take sin away. It was to be done once a year on the 7th month and the 10th day, and I think they call that the term Tishri. And I'm not good on that, but I just read that somewhere. Okay, let's go on down. Verse 29, and this shall be a statute forever unto you, in that the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, you shall afflict your souls, and do no work, whether it be in your own country or a stranger sojourn among you. So anybody come in, been with you. So as I took this, and I tried to do a little back reading on this, so afflict your souls, what I took from it was the fasting part, and do no work, that was counted as a Sabbath. So they were to do no work those days, afflict their souls, and really focus on the past year and the sins, and as they move forward. All right, verse 30. For on that day shall the priest make an atonement for you to cleanse you, that you make you clean from your sins. Verse 31, it shall be a Sabbath rest unto you. You shall afflict your souls by the statute of the year. 32, and the priest whom he shall anoint, from he shall consecrate, minister in the priest office in the Father's stead, shall make atonement, and shall put on the linen clothes, even on the holy garments. He's telling them, whoever takes over, and y'all know, when we get into the book of Numbers, we're going to see the passing of Aaron and the leaders, and that's going to be passed on to somebody else. And he's telling them, now we're not entered into the Holy Land yet, but when they do, this is what we're going to carry this on. This has got to be carried forward, just not now. It's just not something we're doing right now in this leadership. Okay, verse 33, and he shall make an atonement for the holy sanctuary, and he shall make an atonement for the tabernacle of the congregation. That's something we just talked about. And 34, and it shall be an everlasting statute unto you to make an atonement for your children of the Israel and all their sins once a year. Now, this was the Old Testament way of cleansing, taking sin away. We don't have to worry about that in today, because we've already had the sins washed away, if we're a Christian, by Christ, who shed his blood upon the cross. Remember I talked about just a minute ago about, I don't really believe that the apostles believed they knew who he was. They knew what he could do until when he arose on that third day and they saw him. You know, even in that room when Thomas made, I'm going to paraphrase, made the statement, I won't believe it till I can put my hands in the holes of Christ. That's what I thought. I felt like that even the apostles really didn't know who he was until they were able to see and touch him. And of course they couldn't for a while, but until his transfiguration. But anyway, so when we look at all this, and I've got some summary notes there, and I'm not going to read them all because we already talked about all these things. As far as chapter 16 goes, the Day of Atonement. Do you have any question or comment on this so far? Because I want to spend a few minutes. I'm going to pass out 17 and kind of go over a little bit on that. So with that being said, I'm going to get right to it. This is 17. I should have given you that out. I didn't have it the last time. When we look at chapter 17, the heading talks about the value of blood. And it's going to be talking about worship, what you can't do. In other words, I can tell you right now, you can't eat any blood. They're going to tell you, don't eat the blood. And when the animals are killed, and he's going to give them direct instructions on this of how to prepare it so they would not eat the blood. And as we get into that. But I'll wait till everybody gets one. The other thing that I want you to notice in this chapter is how God is going to tell that worship needs to be centralized and socialized. And so when I got to studying this, it kind of brought it back to where we are today. When COVID hit, we couldn't meet. A lot of places we couldn't meet because of the COVID itself. And so we did the best we could with what we had. We had what a lot of people back in 100 years ago didn't have. They have internet, have ways of communicating, broadcast. So we could see some things, but just to be honest with you, it still wasn't like being here. And so I think we forget that, what centralized and socialized worship really is. I think sometimes we get too laid back and thinking that I can watch it on TV and be a part of that. I just don't see that. I miss this when we're not here. I'm disconnected. If I'm watching it on TV, I'm not a part of that. I can see it, but I'm not a part of that. So we're going to talk a little bit about that as we get into this part of the lesson. So I'm going to start just a little bit. I know I don't have much time, just a few minutes, and then I'll stop it. But I want to kind of paraphrase and get a few things started as we did that. The thing I've got noticed there, the Lord's chosen place of worship. I actually went back and put some Deuteronomy in there because I want to bring this up. Let me read a little bit out of Deuteronomy 12:1. These are the statutes of the judgments which ye shall observe to do in the land, which the Lord God of thy fathers give thee to possess it all the days that you live upon the earth. You shall utterly destroy all the places wherein the nations you shall possess, serve their gods upon high mountains and upon the hills and every green tree. You shall overthrow their altars and break their pillars and burn their groves with fire, and you shall hew down the graven images of their gods and destroy the names of them in the places. Now let me say a few things about this. So to understand this, he's telling them, when you go take over and go into this new land, don't conform to them. What had happened, even in Egypt, the Israelites even had picked up some of the old rituals of the Egyptians. And God knew that. And as the things that I've read pointed out, they had a God for everything. The God for the crocodile, the sun god Ra, there's two or three I was trying to, as I read over. And so he's telling them, you don't worship graven images. You worship the true and living God. That's what he's telling them. Now, don't come in and have because what happened was, and I will tell you this as we look at this, some of the things that happened, some of the people, even in the camp of Israel, were doing their own sacrifices. They weren't bringing it to the gates and sacrificing there. They were doing it their own way. And that's why the Egyptians had done. He says, don't do that. Don't worship and do your own thing. It should be a centralized and organized, socialized worship. And that's the point he was trying to make to them when he was doing all this. And as a matter of fact, one of the things I was reading, the Egyptians had a goat god that they worship. I don't know the name. I can't remember the name exactly that was given to it. A goat god. And that was something that's brought over, and even for many years after that, they were show this, and you've seen this sometimes, even the old devil is portrayed as that, hairy, horned goat god. That's where it come from. That's what some of the things they trace back to was the symbolism of that goat god. And we know devil can take a lot of transformations, can't he? He can be anything and anybody, and we have to be on our toes at all time. So with all that being said, I'm going to paraphrase that just for a few minutes as we started this, and I'm assuming we're going to pick back up us on Wednesday. It's not singing Wednesday, is it? Nope, it'll be the first. So Wednesday, we should be able to pick back up on this. I'm assuming everything's still on for Wednesday, right? Okay. All right. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to stop, and I'm going to try to finish on Deuteronomy, and just for a few things, and then we'll stop right here. And of course, we'll have Brother Jim today. We'll be doing our preaching. I appreciate Brother Jim for that and stepping up. I know from my own experience, it's hard to get up, prepare a lesson to do this, to keep everything focused. But thank Brother Jim for that. Okay, with that being said, we'll have a little break and we'll get ready for our preaching. Thank you for your attention.